America's Shadow, from my book Organized Gang Stalking, New Torture Tactic to Neutralize Citizens, published by Lulu. There is a split between who America pretends to be and who she is. The ideal self-image of America is best seen in President George Bush's grand vision to make democracy building a large part of the war on terror. America under Bush saw herself as fighting for freedom. Bush talked about answering the call of history and bringing God's gift of democracy to the Middle East. We were the champions of freedom. We were said to believe in the rule of law, limits on the power of the state, free speech, freedom of worship, equal justice, respect for women, religious and ethnic tolerance, and respect for private property. Iran, Iraq, and North Korea were the axis of evil. We were the good guys doing battle with the rogue nations. We were the heroes bringing liberation to the oppressed. Heeding a call from God to rid the world of evildoers. We saw ourselves as morally superior to other countries. This was the consciousness of America under George Bush. But America had another side, a shadow side, that would be published by the American Civil Liberties Union in a website that they had not too long ago called www.trackedinamerica.org. If you try to find it now, you won't. It seems to have disappeared. It showed the dark side of America. Tracked in America detailed how federal agencies intimidated, harassed, alienated, deported, and silenced individuals in the United States from World War I to post 9/11. The story starts as far back as 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which allowed the president to detain aliens during peacetime and allowed for the wartime arrests, detention, and deportation of dissenters. It describes the pre-World War surveillance of unions, radicals, and immigrants. It explained how during World War I, President Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, CPI, which used tactics that amounted to outright harassment and persecution of dissenters. How the FBI, in conjunction with the American Protective League, monitored dissent throughout the United States. How Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918 to stifle dissent and anti-war protests. How an anti-war speech delivered by Eugene V. Debs resulted in his receiving a 10-year prison sentence. In World War II, the FBI repeatedly used the practice of allying with citizens groups that could operate outside official sanction. It details the internment of Japanese Americans and some German and Italian nationals living in the United States. There was the surveillance and infiltration of left-wing and minority groups, including African Americans, Native Americans, and immigrant groups. There was the notorious House Un-American Activities Committee, the FBI conducting surveillance, pressuring employers to hire or fire particular individuals, and propaganda campaigns. There was the FBI's notorious COINTELPRO program to neutralize dissidents. There was unlawful surveillance, intimidation, and harassment of activists in the civil rights movement against protesters during the Vietnam War. There were secret programs to link the civil rights movement and anti-war protesters to international communism. These actions are examples of abuses committed throughout the history of our country. The more we ignore the dark side of America, the stronger it becomes. It comes to the fore when America is under stress. It is her emotion-based self an overreaction to fear. Jung said the shadow consists of all those reprehensible characteristics we pretend not to have. The more we dissociate it from our conscious life, the more demonic it becomes as we project it outward on individuals and groups. Thus, law enforcement sees idealists as a threat to the social order rather than their own behavior as endangering it. And because we do not acknowledge it, our shadow becomes even darker. We condemn other nations when they use torture, but we will not hold those in our own government who used it accountable. We condemn the Pakistani military for holding suspected militants in indefinite detention, while President Obama gives a speech saying we ourselves might neither try to release some of our detainees in the war on terror. We retain the authority to engage in extraordinary renditions. Our government spies on its own citizens, monitors activists, maintains watch lists with the names of many innocent people. Jung might attribute America's poor judgments and inappropriate perceptions to one-sided development, favoring one function or attitude to the exclusion of its opposite, whereas psychological opposites are essential in achieving wholeness. Naomi Quenk, who wrote a book on typology entitled Beside Ourselves, wrote about how projection is sometimes used as our way to help us achieve wholeness. Projection involves, she said, attributing to others an unacknowledged, unconscious part of ourselves, something that lies outside of our conscious awareness. She continues, the projector unconsciously identifies someone who possesses at least some of the unconscious quality in question, but then exaggerates the degree to which that quality is actually present. The added amount of the quality comes from the projector's unconscious. The person being projected on is then seen as more hostile, lazy, talented, or admirable, for instance, than is really the case. I see this as what is happening with law enforcement, targeting idealists repeatedly throughout history in their programs of surveillance and harassment. Quenk tells us projection often accounts for our rejection of others. Idealists represent law enforcement's shadow, or the undeveloped aspects of their own personality, the missing part of themselves that, if accepted, can offer renewal. The key to America's self-renewal, I think, is to reclaim these rejected parts of herself. The only question is, can America muster the strength to integrate her undiscovered aspects of personality being projected on her enemies? The place to start is by asking herself and honestly answering who she is. Is she really the champion of liberty? Does she really respect the rule of law? Does she really stand for limits on the power of the state? Does she really allow free speech? Does her practices in the war on terror honor the truth that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness and prudence. Indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. How far has America, the country who gives the president the power to kill without due process, to hold people in indefinite detention, to torture without bringing those who do it to justice, to harass and put people under surveillance strayed from the ideals enunciated in our Declaration of Independence. The undiscovered part of law enforcement, those who are supposed to uphold the law, is their idealism. It is her idealism that America has lost touch with in the war on terror. Once we have seen that in examining our shadow, once we acknowledge what we have become, acknowledge we have a shadow, we can integrate it. Another book on topology, Navigating Midlife by Eleanor S. Corlett and Nancy B. Milner, tells us integration is all about balance, the need to balance new insights we gain about ourselves with our existing understanding of who we are. This rarely is an easy process. In fact, midlife can be a time of excess in which we may cling too long to the old worn-out patterns of ourselves or embrace the new at the expense of the old. But neither extreme is successful. Midlife development demands an end to either-or thinking. It leads to both and thinking. The expansion of personality, this movement to becoming all who we are, is a movement toward individuation and spiritual growth. The challenge America faces is to initiate that spiritual growth or continue down the path she is going with her persona, her social mask, loudly paying lip service to the ideals enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, ideals of freedom, of adherence to the rule of law, of limits on the power of the state, of free speech, of justice, while her shadow part betrays those very ideals by surveilling and harassing the idealists among her citizens, by engaging in practices such as allowing the president to order people killed with no due process, to put people in indefinite detention, even reserve the right to torture when she feels she must.